everyone.
Oh, you're so nice.
Welcome.
Thank you, Carl.
I can't let
Thank you all for being
No.
here today. Some of you know, quite a few of you I do not know. My name is Penny Wright, and I'm in charge of adult programs here at the library, and welcome to each one of you. Since we have somewhat of quite a few new faces in this audience, I know that some of you live out of our library district. And therefore, if you are interested in learning about what kind of programs we do at this library, because we do a lot, if you join the Friends of the Library, easy, fill out the blanks, pay $10, whatever you want to pay, the library will mail you a newsletter every 3 months. Then you'll be up to snuff on lots of stuff that you may want to know about. I wanted to mention that the outside on the table as you walked in, many of you probably didn't notice this, but there's a small stack, still some left, of these copies of the Jewish World, and I think there's enough for some of you to take a copy. That was very nice of them to give us copies. I wanted to thank the people who are responsible for this event today, and there are 2 people involved. One is Mary Cummings, whose friendship with Karl brought about this program. Mary is in the back, and she's the archivist director of the archives of the Southampton History Museum. And if you don't visit that place regularly, you should, because it's a really great place. So Mary Cummings is a person to be thanked, as is Tom Edmonds, who's the director of that museum. Tom and the library collaborate on many different programs. Some are held there, some are held here. This one happens to be very easy for us because it was their idea and they organized it. But we are happy that it's being held here. I'll tell you a couple of things about Karl Grossman, for those of you who don't know him. More than 100 years ago, Karl Grossman's grandfather, Hermann Grossman, an engraver, came to the United States from Hungary and worked at Fahey's watch case factory in Sag Harbor. Hermann married Stephanie Spitz, and the couple later moved to New York, which is where Karl was born. Since 1974, Karl and his wife Janet have lived in Sag Harbor, where his grandfather began his life in America. That connection to the East End through his grandparents has inspired a strong interest in the history of Jews in the East End. A journalist throughout his adult life, Karl writes regularly for Jewish publications, including the Long Island Jewish World and the Jewish Tribune. He also has a blog on the Times of Israel. He is a specialist in investigative reporting and has been chief investigative reporter for WVBH-TV, for which he wrote and hosted the hour-long documentary, The Unusual Jewish History of Sag Harbor. He writes a syndicated column which appears weekly in Suffolk County newspapers, including the Southampton, East Hampton, Shelter Island, and Sag Harbor papers. As a professor of journalism, he has taught full-time for the State University of New York at Old Westbury for 40 years. He also taught journalism at Southampton College until it closed. He has hosted a nationally aired television program, Enviro Close-Up with Karl Grossman, for 27 years, and is the author of 6 books, including Cover Up, What You Are Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power. Power Crazy, Is Lilko Turning Shoreham into America's Chernobyl, and Weapons in Space. Karl Grossman has received many awards from the Press Club of Long Island, which he founded and served as its first president. It's an honor to have him here today. Please welcome Karl Grossman.
Thank you so much for coming. What I'd like to do is start off the program with just the first 10 minutes of the video that I did, The Unusual Jewish History of Sag Harbor. So if we can roll that, I think it would, well, I think it would bring things to this presentation that I couldn't just by speaking. So if we can roll the film. I didn't know, in fact, that the DVD would work. I changed the book from the DVD, and it's a crapshoot whether that machine would work. So my presentation is always is, you know, I don't consider the video, if it works, great, if it doesn't work, so I'll have to kind of add a little bit. But I think you'd like seeing the video. I think Gertrude Katz talks about growing up in State Park in the 30s and 40s, and it's like, it only really much of Long Island South Fork. That's the beginning.
I realize that, yeah.
Basically, all postcard changes.
Yeah, trying.
Lucky there's no two-tone involved. Audio visual.
Interesting layout. Is that the first?
We did dim the lights in the room too.
Yeah, hang on just a sec, I just.
And bring up the audio if you will.
You're right, you're on a roll.
Please bring up the sound a little bit.
I understand, yeah.
This is Temple Aras Israel in Sag Harbor. This is Temple Aras Israel in Sag Harbor, New York, the oldest synagogue on Long Island. It describes itself outside of New York City. It began as Temple Mishkan Israel with its first services in 1898 for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Legend has it that it received its first Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, from Teddy Roosevelt. The Torah had been used when Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, after fighting in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, were quarantined for a time in Montauk. Although Roosevelt was accepting, it was a time when Jews weren't accepted on much of Long Island's South Fork. Sag Harbor's nearby villages of East Hampton and Southampton were basically off limits to Jews. But Jews, unusually, were accepted here in Sag Harbor. Joseph Fahey's built what became a watch case factory in Sag Harbor. Here's his mausoleum in Oakland Cemetery in Sag Harbor, the biggest mausoleum in the cemetery to this day. Fahey's, incidentally, was the great-great-grandfather of former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, originally from East Hampton. Fahey sought out Jewish engravers from Hungary, where engraving was a fine art among Jews. He or his representatives would meet them after they arrived on Ellis Island and bring them to Sag Harbor. This is why my grandfather and grandmother came to Sag Harbor. Here in a display case at Temple Aras Israel are my grandfather's talis and tefillin and other articles used by Jews in prayer. My grandfather came from Hungary to Sag Harbor around 1900 to work at Fahey's watch case factory. My grandmother's sister had married into the Spitz family in Sag Harbor, many of whose members worked at the watch case factory. And here in Sag Harbor, my grandfather and grandmother met and fell in love. Hungarian Jews, like Hungarians in general, have considered themselves very special indeed in Hungary. The food is unique, the language is very special. And the Hungarian Jews who came here to work in the watch case factory didn't get along with Jews who had been here in Sag Harbor from Poland and Russia and other places where Jews had been dispersed. After a time, the Hungarian Jews prayed above the Engravers Hall on Main Street in Sag Harbor, not here. And here, if you look closely, you can still see the 2 entrances and the fence down the middle of the Jewish cemetery serving Sag Harbor. Originally, the Hungarian Jews were buried on one side, the other Jews on the other. The separation finally ended after several decades. Wasn't it nuts? Well, Jews weren't accepted in East Hampton or Southampton. Here in Sag Harbor, there was this dopey split. The temple was originally Orthodox, the most traditional branch of Judaism. In the 1920s, there was a major fire in Sag Harbor, and then, in the 30s of the Depression, with Sag Harbor suffering with the rest of the nation economically. Gertrude Katz grew up in Sag Harbor during that time. Now, what was it like for a Jewish girl in Sag Harbor then?
Actually, it was a wonderful place to be brought up in. Everybody was of some ethnic origin. It was Jewish, Italian, Irish, and there were a whole group of us that lived over all the stores on the main street. That was a kind of an our gang thing, but mixed, very mixed. Really, I didn't feel the difference when I was very young. It was at the onset of the war in Germany that I became very conscious of my Jewishness. It was constantly a presence with the Nazis and so on, but the community as a whole was always very good to us and very gracious. My father died when I was 10 years old, and the community was wonderful to my mother and to me. So I didn't feel the separateness. Little incidents would happen. I don't know, maybe I was in 3rd grade when I discovered that calling my grandfather Zeta was not appropriate. I didn't know that wasn't an American term. And I quickly dropped it, and he became Grandpa instead of Zeta. And I tried, we were always welcome in everyone's homes, and as far as the religion goes, economically, we had the upper level in Sag Harbor, the middle level, the ladies that stayed home and didn't work. That was always fascinating to me. My mother waited on a lot of my friends' mothers, which I took to mean that somehow we weren't quite equal. But the Jewish community we weren't separate. We were all assimilated. We had our separate functions, where the variety store is now upstairs was one building owned by Mrs. Myers, and we had all our functions, our synagogue, forum parties and so forth, in what was called Myers Hall upstairs. And I thought that was the most glamorous place in the world, and I thought someday maybe I could be married there. I thought that would be the epitome of. And as we walk past 5 and 10 now, and I always look upstairs and I think about those wonderful days. Jews came from all over to our little temple because we were the only one. Montauk, right through. Riverhead was the next one. So we had a big drawing crowd, and when the holidays came, they took rooms in town. There was a little Flower Hill house, I think it was on Garden Street, where people took rooms, or else their friends or neighbors put them up, because everybody walked to the synagogue in those days. You didn't ride. The women sat upstairs, and it was a very interesting. It was an interesting time, and we had a couple of school teachers that we had store Raffs. The Raff family, you see his name on the outside of the cemetery. They had 4 daughters and a son who was a dentist in Hampton Bays, and they always organized the poor parties and taught the kids their parts. And we always had one king because he was the only boy, and all of us grew up to be Queen Esther's eventually. Got that part. But as far as being a part of the community, I really never felt that separate from my friends. And the war was the factor that was a reminder constantly of who you were.
Your mother ran a store here in Sag Harbor?
Yes. Sag Harbor, next door to the movies. She was in 1930 until she died in 84. And the Sag Harbor community put the flag at half-mast at my mother's funeral, which just is an example of the wonderful feelings that we had for everybody. And it just was a wonderful time. We had a sisterhood in the temple, a group of women. May Kellman, and she's here still. She's just celebrated her 99th birthday. Husband was a dentist, very active. Louise Spitz, Arthur Spitz's wife, and Arthur were very active in the temple. And they were all very important parts, and we used to do a dinner in Bowden Square every year, and everybody came and supported us. It was important for us to support the churches and the church followers to support us. We counted on each other. We couldn't exist without each other. And even now I see the churches are in a lot of trouble because some people don't give to them and don't support them. And it's really sad that we've lost that fundraiser. We had cake sales. Then we graduated, went to cakeless cake sales. Just send your money and don't bother to make a cake. It was very good. It was very worthwhile and fun.
The Jews were so welcome in Sag Harbor, but like in Southampton, East Hampton, that was another story.
Southampton, there was no place for the Jews. Actually, that is why Hampton Bays became a thriving community. They went to Hampton Bays. It was known that they just, East Hampton was in a class by itself. I don't really know what was going on there. But then eventually, yes, that's how we split. East Hampton got Jews and they broke off from our little temple and they got the big Jewish center. They not only got Jewish people, but they got the big money.
One of your favorite teachers was Pop Mazzio?
Pop Mazzio was a legend in Sag Harbor. He was the music teacher, I would say forever, and he was the reason you have a community band here now. And Pop Mazzio didn't graduate college. He was not a teacher. He taught us all music in school. And the way he taught was, you would put the music in front of you, and then he would hum it, and that's how we would play it, and we all played it, and we had a great band. And coming into ninth grade, one day Pop Mazzio with me to stay after a band rehearsal.
We'll cut it now, okay? Yeah, the tracking is good. But she talks about Pop Mazzio then having her be the drum major of the band. And she said, one day, I promised your father that I would do it. So, there's tears in your eyes. But it's breaking up. But if anybody wants to watch this the video, it's on YouTube. I did it for BBH, and BBH put it up on YouTube. Just put my name in. You can put Unusual Jewish History of Sag Harbor, or just put Sag Harbor or Sag Harbor History, and you can watch it. There'll be no breakup, at least on YouTube. This is what I always fear with DVDs. Give me video cassettes any day. Now, if you just hit the lights a little bit more, okay? Thanks so much, Ben.
These slides are...
Yeah, oh, great. Oh, let there be, okay. I put together a prepared text. I'm going to ad-lib from it at points because I didn't know for sure whether the DVD would work. Again, I teach often with DVDs, and maybe 2/3 of the time it works, and the other times it doesn't. So I always prepare figuring that I'm not going to have the visual aid. There's a great diversity among Jews and Jewish houses of worship on Long Island's East End. There's an old joke among Jews about a Jew being discovered marooned on a desert island and the two synagogues he built. You must have heard this joke. One he proudly declares is the temple he attends. The other, that's the synagogue I wouldn't go to, he explains. And there are variations of the gig. It's more complicated than that. For a relatively small tribe, Jews, there's just great variety. There are 15 million Jews in the world today, 2 million less than before the Holocaust. And there's great commonality. I've been lucky to have traveled around the world with my wife, who's here, and gone to synagogues in Florence, Italy, and in, I believe, Singapore. In Russia, I've spent a lot of time in Russia giving talks, actually. Hungary, back in Hungary, where the the biggest synagogue in all of Eastern Europe was in Budapest. Still stands. Scotland, Curacao is a nice place to visit a synagogue. It's the oldest synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. St. Thomas, the second oldest. Rhodes, the island of Rhodes in Greece, and of course Israel. This is not so unusual. Many Jews, while traveling, like to visit synagogues. And you visit these synagogues and you find a strong consistency among Jews, along with the variety. Now, in my giving the presentation, as I say in my prepared text, let me start with my paternal grandparents settled in Sag Harbor. And as noted in the film, Jews came to Sag Harbor in substantial numbers when Fahey's opened his watch cake factory in 1881. He recruited Jewish engravers and also Italian engravers. You ever curious why there's so many Italians too in Sag Harbor? It's really because of Joseph Fahey's. He must have, I mean, considering that Howard Dean is his great-great-grandson, he must have, I think, a kind of a progressive bent, or had a progressive bent as Howard Dean had. He was originally from France. As I noted in the documentary, he'd go to Ellis Island or send his representatives to recruit engravers and to bring them out to Sag Harbor. Now, my grandfather came to Sag Harbor in about 1900 to work at Fahey's. And in Sag Harbor, he met Stephanie Spiegel, also a Hungarian Jew. Now, you can't see this too well from where you sit, but here's a picture of my grandfather and grandmother in love in 19 whatever it would have been in Sag Harbor. I show it in the video. And here I couldn't show this in the video, but we have it hanging in our bedroom at home. He was a very talented guy. Stephanie Spiegel, Sag Harbor, who engraved this for my grandmother. Stephanie's sister, Ernestine, had married into the Spitz family. I mentioned that in the video too. And they had a store, this I didn't mention, where appliances were sold, right on Main Street. It's where Fisher's Fine Furniture is today. That was Spitz's appliance store, and some of them worked at the watch case factory. For those of you who go to Adas Israel, Temple Adas Israel in Sag Harbor, on the memorial plaque, one of the early memorial plaques, is the name of Ernestine, died in 1921. Herman met Stephanie while she was staying with Ernestine in Sag Harbor. Then Herman and Stephanie left Sag Harbor for the city where my father and I were born. A few names down on the plaque at Adas Israel was that of Ernestine's nephew, Arthur Spitz, who was quite active in Sag Harbor government. He was a village trustee. And Arthur told me, this is a conversation we had in front of the American Hotel when we first came here in '74, that Herman had made this enormous mistake moving to the city. During the Depression, Arthur said, we could glean potatoes from the fields in Bridgehampton and otherwise survive, where Grandpa Herman lost his job as an engraver in Manhattan and under financial stress had a heart attack and died very prematurely. My folks lived in Brooklyn and Queens, and after my father was making rather good money on Gramercy Park in Manhattan for 50 years. So I'm a credentialed New York Jew. But having lived out here for 45 years in Noyak, hamlet of Sag Harbor, and for 13 years before that elsewhere in Suffolk, I think I know both Jewish worlds. Now, a wrinkle in the Sag Harbor Jewish story, which I opened that video with, is this nutty separation in the cemetery between Hungarian Jews and the other Jews. Let's see, in a well-researched 1986 work, Yankees and Yarmulkes, Small-Town Jewish Life in Eastern Long Island, the late Helene Gerard, some of you from west of the canal might remember Helene. She was a librarian in Eastport. She writes about how in 1890 the Jewish Cemetery Association of Sag Harbor was formed, quote, with 6 trustees, all of them Russian Jews. This is significant, Helene went on, because in Sag Harbor there were 2 distinct Jewish communities, the Jews from Russia and those from Hungary. Both groups brought with them European social antagonisms and refused to worship, socialize, or be buried together. And how nuts can you get? She writes, the Hungarians formed their own independent Jews Cemetery Association in Sag Harbor in 1899, and this was next to, quote, the Russian Jewish cemetery. A fence, which is still there, I do that stand up in front of the fence, was erected between the two. The fence still exists. In the documentary at the cemetery, I comment how dopey it was. There was a division between Jews in Sag Harbor, considering Jews weren't particularly welcome in neighboring East Hampton and Southampton, and frankly, it was beyond dopey. Hungarian Jews might have thought themselves better amid the stratification of Jews. Many a German Jew and a Sephardic Jew also had this notion. But for the Nazis, it didn't matter whether a Jew was in Hungary or Poland or Russia or Germany or so on. They killed them all, including all my relatives on both sides of the family. Half were from Hungary, my father's side, and half were from Poland, all slaughtered. In fact, we have also in our bedroom a picture of my grandfather Herman on a boat in one of those ventilators. He's like, somehow he climbed up, and he was visiting his family back in this small village in Hungary he came from, including his 4 sisters, and all wiped out. Mrs. Gerard cites a Brooklyn Daily Eagle article, and the Brooklyn Eagle was the most important paper on Long Island way back when, on the dedication of Temple Adas Israel in 1900, describing it as, quote, the synagogue of the Jewish Association of United Brethren of Sag Harbor, with a membership of 36 persons, all of Russian origin. In fact, that photo there's a photo of, and that same photo, a big photo, hangs in the synagogue of these men in front of the synagogue. Again, all Russian. Quote, another Hebrew society, this is the Brooklyn Daily Eagle now, apart from the United Brethren also exists, known as the Independent Jewish Association. It is largely composed of natives of Hungary. The society had this week rented in Gravers Hall for their celebration of Rosh Hashanah. Mrs. Gerard also notes the Brooklyn Eagle article reporting 20 years ago it would have been difficult to find a representative of the Hebrew race in Sag Harbor, but the establishment of the Fahey's watch case factory has brought large numbers. In business, the Jews have pushed rapidly to the fore. Upon the main business thoroughfares, 15 large stores testified to their industry. In 1918, she relates, the Sag Harbor Jewish community had financial difficulties and the synagogue's mortgage was foreclosed. 3 members of the congregation bought it back at public auction, and later that year a new certificate of incorporation was filed, and from the names listed, Helene relates, it's clear that by then the Russian and Hungarian factions had finally made peace and joined in one congregation. But it took 20 years, you know. And there's still 2 separate cemeteries. I mean, it's not Hungarian and Russian anymore, but one is owned by Temple Adas Israel and one is the Independent Cemetery Association. Now, this is fascinating to me. In terms of Jewish numbers in Sag Harbor, Mrs. Gerard cites a 1902 Sag Harbor Express article reporting, quote, a recent census indicating a total population of 3,438. The article continued, our population is cosmopolitan. There are about 650 adults of foreign birth. Again, this is in the Sag Harbor Express. Quote, the Hebrew invasion, which is comparatively recent, sums up men, women, and children about 500. You put it all together, what that means is nearly 15% of Sag Harbor's population early in the last century were Jews. I mean, quite remarkable. The Sag Harbor article went on, the Sag Harbor Express article went on, that some arrived by Ellis Island by steamer to be greeted at the dock, the Long Wharf it would be, by the townspeople crying, Jerusalem is coming, Jerusalem is here. I mean, isn't that nice? You know, they welcomed the Jews. Now let's jump to East Hampton, but that was not the case. Over in, wait till I get to Southampton. Over in East Hampton, no one was proclaiming Jerusalem is here. There were very few Jews. Indeed, a 2009 story in the Southampton Press about the 50th anniversary of the Jewish Center of the Hamptons in East Hampton reported that in the 1950s, the East Hampton Jewish community consisted of perhaps 11 families, most of whom ran local businesses. It was at East Hampton's exclusive Maidstone Club where Groucho Marx, after being told while playing golf as a guest that he wouldn't be allowed to join because he was a Jew, famously commented, quote, "My kids are only half Jewish. Can they play at least the front nine?" If you Google that, you'll see a lot of references to that famous joke. But it ain't a joke, frankly, in certain reasons. Deserving much credit for breaking the discriminatory floodgates in East Hampton is the late Evan Frankel. Anybody here knew Evan? Great. Janet knew Evan. Janet there in the back knew Evan. He was quite the character. He was a tough Jew from the Lower East Side, scrappy as could be. And I vividly recall, I did a number of stories for the Jewish press in the main. And also we were members of Jewish Center of the Hamptons way back then, because Al Sidra was a part-time synagogue, part-time rabbi, really kind of a summer shul. I vividly recall Evan telling, so that's how I got to know him, Evan telling me how he had become, quote, the sole Jew living south of Montauk Highway in East Hampton. This is back in the 40s. And an 11-acre estate at that, south of Montauk Highway, where his estate was and is the most upscale part of East Hampton Village. Evan had come to the East End to build radar facilities during World War II. Steel was in short supply, and Evan had figured out a way to use wood to construct frames on which the radar equipment would perch. Some of the few Jews in East Hampton had come to him in the 1950s, he related to me, wanting to build a little shul. This is his quote. Evan characteristically thought in a big way. He bought the stately Borden estate on Montauk Highway, the main entrance into East Hampton Village. Establishing Jewish presence in this way was very important to Evan. He wanted it shown, he told me, that the Jews had arrived in East Hampton. So anybody entering East Hampton would see the synagogue. After acquiring the building and 4 acres on which it sits, he donated it for what would be the Jewish Center of the Hamptons. He worked closely with another wealthy Jew, J.M. Kaplan, who had a summer house in East Hampton, north of Montauk Highway. It's along Route 114. It's now the Center for Conservation in East Hampton of the Nature Conservancy, and that's where Kaplan lived. Evan was central to getting Norman Jaffe, the late great architect from Bridgehampton, to design what's now the sanctuary of the Jewish Center of the Hamptons. Now, as I know, we were members, my family were members of the Jewish Center of the Hamptons then, because Adas Israel had no Hebrew school, very limited activities. Indeed, Gertrude Katz, who you just saw in the video, recollects that, quote, after Hanukkah, we closed up for the rest of the winter. The synagogue, Adas Israel, was kept alive by Gert and her husband, the late Donald Katz. He was an accountant, a very fine accountant, based in Sag Harbor. Her mother, Nettie Rosenstein, Nettie's brother, Max Katz. David Lee, who was very important. And later in that video, you catch it on YouTube, it's an hour long, can't run it now. David Lee was a British fellow, came here after the war and found this little synagogue on a hill and was committed all his life to Adas Israel. He died last year. The Kelmans, Gert mentions May Kelman. Now, she died last year, May did, at 103. Arthur Spitz and his wife Louise, among others. Now, a turning point came in 2010 when, after more than a century, Leon Morris, the last of several part-time rabbis, became the synagogue's first full-time rabbi. And in 2014, after Rabbi Morris and his family made Aliyah, that means like moving on, moving up to Israel, he went to Israel, he was succeeded by Rabbi Daniel Geffen. Long before, our 2 sons were bar mitzvahed at the Jewish Center of the Hamptons, and I helped on the sanctuary project. Evan was there was a lot of resistance to the sanctuary in the synagogue because Norman was this visionary architect. I mean, some of his houses here, like landmarks in modern architecture. And it would be in the vision of Norman Jaffe. And Evan asked me to sit down with him and Norman. I mean, it was night after night at Norman's house, try to put into words what Norman was trying to build. And I mean, if you've not gone there, go there. It's an absolutely amazing design for what turned out to be one of, if not the most, striking Jewish sanctuaries in the world. It's named Gates of the Grove. I mean, Norman explained to me how he would embed into this synagogue Hasidic sequence of numerals, and how it would be wood. He grew up in the West Coast, Northwest. He saw wood, lumber, timber being taken off ships from British Columbia and so on. And so he always felt he wanted to build a sanctuary, wanted to build a sanctuary of wood. And also, he referred to the wooden Jewish synagogues in the shtetls of Poland, of Eastern Europe. So he wanted to reflect that too. Let's get to Southampton. As for Southampton, it's telling that the website of the Chabad Jewish Center of Southampton, which got its start in 1995, speaks of Chabad of Southampton, the first synagogue in historic Southampton since the founding of Southampton in 1640. So it took from 1640 to 1995 for a synagogue to be built in Southampton. And here I'm quoting from a story in the New York Magazine. You can imagine, this is when the Chabad was trying to have a foothold on Hill Street in Southampton. Related a story in New York Magazine, the consternation when a family arrived that clearly hadn't seen the membership brochure for the village. The man had a bird's nest of a beard and wore dark suits all day long. He and his wife were young but had a bevy of children. 2 at first, 5 before long. They invited guests on Saturday morning, dozens of them, being referred to were Rabbi Raphael and Shani Kanakov, who was still here. The story went on almost immediately. Southamptonites began whispering, who are these people? What do they want? What do we do about them? Soon enough, complaints were registered, letters were sent. Finally, the villagers did what Hamptonites had done before them in the face of unprecedented change. They sued. And it was quite a struggle for the Chabad. Now, my dear doctor and friend sitting right there, Dr. Alan Fine, came to the aid of the Chabad. As Alan wrote in a letter to the Southampton Press, he was proud of this fine addition to our community. Chabad has an outstanding record, Alan wrote, of positive service and an incomparable warm hospitality. Shalom Chabad, declared Fine, Dr. Fine, articulating Jewish togetherness, which is such an important thing, which has been absent here and around the world, even in Israel today, so often, Jewish togetherness. The Long Island Jewish World, which crusaded for the Southampton Chabad, editorialized when it finally received a key element of municipal agreement, municipal approval. It has taken 2 years, but now the Village of Southampton's Zoning Board of Appeals has done the right thing. It said the board's vote reconfirms our faith in the American way. The editorial went on, ours is a land in which religious and cultural diversity is prized, and this is a value to which accommodation should be made whenever practical. In Southampton, there's the equivalent in history of the Maidstone Club, the Meadow Club. As the Jewish Telegraph Agency reported in 1959 about numerous clubs in the New York area closed to Jews and Negroes. This is all quotes here. Oliver Rogers, president of the Meadow Club, said there were no Negro members, but declined to say whether there were any Jewish members. And that was a Jewish Telegraph Agency piece, which I have in a big batch of papers here. Now, an excellent book, and I just came upon it. I didn't know it. I mean, Mary Cummings, sitting back there, pointed me to this book, written by a fellow who grew up here in Southampton, titled Together But Apart, The Jewish Experience in the Hamptons. it's hard to get the book. Even you go on Amazon, it's kind of, I don't think it had much of a run, and they're kind of expensive, but I bet it's in this library, and it was in the Sag Harbor Library, nicely enough. Published in 1966, it was written by Abe Frank, born, quote, when there were about 20 Jewish families in Southampton, and he was raised here. He went on to Columbia Law School, became an attorney, then an administrative law judge for the National Labor Relations Board in Washington. During World War II, Abe was in the Army and was with the 120th Evacuation Hospital when it ended Buchenwald concentration camp after it was liberated in April 1945. And he gives an eyewitness account of the horror in Together But Apart. And he also writes about life in Southampton way back when. And I'm so glad he did it, because I really felt when Mary asked me to give this talk, there might be some defensiveness. How do you know that it was all kind of anti-Semitism in Southampton? I'm quoting now from Abe Frank, a native son. Quote, was there anti-Semitism in Southampton? Of course, it lurked in hidden corners of hostile minds waiting to confront us, usually on unequal terms, like a constant pressure on the nerves, a part of day-to-day living. And we put up with it as an old man puts up with ringing in his ears. For Jews in Southampton, quote, we had to accept there were people who did not like Jews, any Jews, and there were times when the knife cut deeply. Nowhere around it in Southampton we were different from other people. We had a sort of prescience as to who was anti-Semitic and who was not. People put out vibes, sometimes unintentionally, and our antennae were always quick to catch them. And Abe Frank also writes, while there was obviously no welcome mat for Jews in Southampton, not everyone bore a grudge against the family of Israel and Rachel. And there were many who showed generosity and kindness to the Israelite in their midst. There was also, he relates, a refuge, and this is ironic in Southampton, this library, Rogers Memorial Library, where we could spend an afternoon. It was a delightful retreat for this Jewish boy in Southampton. It was in this library, he writes, I learned to revere those astonishing men and women who could open their hearts to a printed page and make of dreams a story. He also writes about later on an incident that deserves to be mentioned, and his quote, because it shows how far I had come from Southampton and how close I remained to it. After the war, I took a job as an attorney with the federal government in Washington. On one occasion, I spent a few hours at a party in the company of several Army officers who I had not previously met. By the time the party was over, I had a strange feeling that there was something familiar and vaguely unpleasant. A few days later, it hit me. My God, I thought, that was a Southampton feeling. Isn't that sad? When the Chabad of East Hampton was established, there was difficulty too, and there was difficulty, but not as intense. It was real intense in this village as it was in Southampton. In Sag Harbor, the Center for Jewish Life is the newest Chabad on the East End. In 2013, it first held services in the living room of the home of Rabbi Vera Lehrman and his wife Broka in North Haven, and at the Sag Harbor Inn, and then in 2017 got a new spiritual home, a huge space that had been the temporary location of John Germain Memorial Library while it was being expanded and renovated. That's right across the street from the post office. Big space, they were so lucky to get it. And in fact, I first gave this presentation when Rabbi Lehrman kind of got to town and found out about me. Would you like to go to Chabad and give a talk about Jews on the, he was interested in the Hamptons. And it was an interesting talk for me because here was a lot of guys with black hats from Brooklyn in the audience. I mean, they were Hasidic Jews, and it was part of the Chabad movement. The Chabad movement is a portion of the Hasidic movement. And they were very, very interested being from Brooklyn, as I was at one point in my life, where Jews are and were plentiful, to hear the story of Jews out here. Here I just wanted to mention that the Chabads here and around the world are part of a main branch of Hasidic Judaism, a spiritual revival movement born in Eastern Europe in the 18th century. And to me, seeing the Hasids, like I go to the post office to get my mail in Sag Harbor from Noyak, and seeing the Hasids, because you're not supposed to use a car if you're a really observant Jew, walking on the bridge, you know, from North Haven, it reminds me of being, there's a city in Israel called Sfat, which is like, it was where the Kabbalah really came from. A center for Jewish spirituality in Israel, and also where there's been a revival of it's like being, to me, like being with Sholem Aleichem 200 years ago, you know, in Eastern Europe. That whole culture that was eradicated by the Nazis, you can see in Sfat, or these days you can see it in Sag Harbor, looking at that bridge. You know, that culture that was murdered alive again. And there's the conservative synagogue. I don't want to get too confusing here. There's also out synagogue to a large degree. The conservative, that's what I was talking about, the desert island and the Jew, you know. There's the conservative synagogue of the Hamptons. It was established in 1999. Its website describes it as a fully egalitarian, fully participatory synagogue and extended family. Its origins involve, in part, some members of Temple Adas Israel wanting to change from its Reform Judaism. There's four basic roads in Judaism: Orthodox, and then above Orthodox, obviously the Hasidic, the ultra-Orthodox, the conservative, then there's a Reconstructionist, and Reform. And there were folks who were lovely folks, I mean, I knew them, at our temple who felt that the Reform, though it was originally started as an Orthodox synagogue, it being Reformed didn't suit their spiritual needs. And they were involved, then there was a big election, and Jews were fighting Jews in terms of elected offices at Adas Israel, and the ones who wanted a more conservative path, they lost. And so the conservative synagogue of Hamptons, in part, was a result of that. And also there were some people who kind of moved to town and wanted to have a more conservative synagogue. Further describing itself, the congregation says on its website that it's based on caring, common goals, mutual respect and responsibility. We share a hunger for that which is essential and true, and an openness to being moved or even transformed. Becomes a synagogue to sensitize our souls to the holy, to deepen our relationship with each other, ourselves, and God, and to attain a great measure of sanctity and meaning in our lives. Rabbi Jan Urbach, who's just a lovely one, an excellent rabbi, is the spiritual leader of that congregation. Like Things Heal, Adas Israel and the Conservative Synagogue, we have joint events now together. So it isn't the split that the deep split that originally existed isn't as deep as it was. And then there's the Hampton Synagogue in West Hampton Beach. I don't know if from West Hampton Beach here. And that's an Orthodox synagogue established in what was an extremely Gentile village, West Hampton Beach, until recent years, because of the synagogue, frankly. Founded in 1990 by Rabbi Mark Schneier of Manhattan's Park East Synagogue, there was strife at this synagogue, which included strife among Jews in connection with the shul's attempt to establish an eruv. An eruv is a marked area allowing Orthodox Jews to wheel baby carriages and carry items prohibited from being carried when going to and from Sabbath services and High Holy Day services. An organization called Jewish People Opposed to the Eruv was formed. The New York Times quoted Arnold Schiefer, its leader, as saying, "As a Reformed Jew, I find it extremely offensive to create a distinction that this is a Jewish area." The Eruv fight brought out intense anti-Semitism, and this to me is very important, below the surface in West Hampton Beach. In 2008, my former journalism student, Tim Lauby, ran for mayor of West Hampton Beach, where he grew up. He had taught him journalism. He was a reporter at the Southampton Press. Then he went into government. He was the clerk of the Suffolk County Legislature, and then he was elected a West Hampton Beach trustee, and he was appointed deputy mayor too. And running for mayor as the Aruv battle raged, he supported the Aruv. He pointed to what happened in Tenafly, New Jersey, where all kinds of money was spent on a lawsuit to stop an Aruv. The same thing happened incidentally in West Hampton Beach, where a lawsuit was brought. And there's an Aruv there today. Now, Tim's father was Jewish, but nobody in West Hampton Beach knew it. Tim's father and their mother, they ran the Hampton Theater, little movie theater in West Hampton Beach. The Hampton Arts movie. Tim told me when he campaigned for mayor, and I wrote a piece on this in my column in the Southampton Press, how one village resident said to him, "I don't care about what it costs, keep the Jews out." Yeah, again, Tim didn't realize that this was underneath the surface in the community he grew up in. And another said, "You got to stand up to these damn Jews." In fact, I went on in the column with other quotes, virulent anti-Semitic quotes from his neighbors. And 8 days before the election, there was a full-page ad proclaiming a vote for Tim Lowby and John Rowland is a vote to turn West Hampton Beach into an Orthodox Jewish community. Rowland was an anchor man at New York Television, Channel 5 anchor. And they were soundly defeated. My piece reported that in the wake of Tim's exposure to anti-Semitism in West Hampton Beach, he decided to move. He didn't, quote, feel this is where I want to stay the rest of my life. West Hampton Beach was not the place I thought it was. Tim did move to East Mauritius, which is across the border, where his son is now growing up and is a student at the Eastport South Manor Central School District, of which Tim is now the district's assistant superintendent for business and operations. And I called Tim before giving this talk today. You know, anything has changed, if nothing has changed. I lived through it. Is what he said. And it was terrible, which is frankly emblematic of the experience of Jews through the millennia. And we lived through it. Some of us didn't live through it. Now let me speak of a synagogue almost as old as Temple Adas Israel, it is Congregation Tiferet Israel in Greenport. Its cornerstone was laid in 1903 and it was dedicated in 1904. The synagogue relates on its website that among the waves of immigrants from Europe to the U.S. in the 1880s, 2 million of these hopeful pilgrims were Jews from Eastern Europe. Most remained in the cities where bright colors of the American dream often faded under grinding gray poverty. Some were determined to find a better way. Many headed west, a few came east to rural Long Island. Those first hardy souls struck out among the roads and railroad tracks of the island, peddling such items as needles and thread, ribbons and combs. Eventually they found a spot to their liking and settled down. One of those places was Greenport. Quote, there is no record of exactly when the first Jewish immigrants came to the village, but it is known several families lived here before 1880. When that trend continued into the century's last decade, the time was right for, quoting from the website, for area Jews to be a gathering for worship. The first service was held during the High Holy Days of 1892 in the home of Lazar Kobre. Later, regular services were held in the home of Fanny Levine. In 1900, a small group of men assembled in the home of Nathan Golden. So he's from the Golden's Furniture. It's in Greenport to organize the Jewish families of Greenport into a formal congregation. Samuel Levine, in the history of the first 50 years of Temple Tiferet Israel, wrote, their assets were mainly faith, as they were certainly poor in worldly possessions. Tiferet Israel was expanded with a social hall in 1964, expanded again in 2000 and 2001. And if you've not been in it, it's like Adas Israel, very quaint, very homey. There's a Jewish word called Hamisha, which is like, you know, some Yiddish words you can't describe. It means like homey and comfortable and, you know, not showy. In 2006, its sanctuary was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The temple But here we go again. Congregation Tiferet Israel is also known strife. As was reported in the New York Times in 2005, until recently, this old whaling village had a small Jewish population with a simple story. Over the years, Jews arrived as shopkeepers or bought summer homes and essentially settled here. They carried Torah scrolls from home to home before building a synagogue in 1903, but 18 months ago, a new rabbi came to town with ideas to expand the synagogue and transport Greenport into the Catskills. This rabbi wanted to make Greenport a Jewish tourist destination. The Rabbi Gary Moskowitz, who actually my cousin Marty's wife, Ina, just sent me an email because I sent her this president. Oh, I studied with Rabbi Moskowitz, and he was a nice fellow. May have been a very nice fellow back in the Bronx when Ina grew up there. But he wanted to attract Jewish single groups looking at, maybe he's still a nice fellow now. And probably was a nice fellow then, but he wanted to attract Jewish single groups looking for weekend getaways, host to retreats for other congregations, and have busloads of Jewish tourists. His arrival set off a small-town debate between stasis and change that soon mushroomed into a battle between the rabbi and his congregation. And it was a mess. The contract of Rabbi Moskowitz, who in addition to being a rabbi, was a security consultant, a karate instructor. In fact, Ida said she took karate lessons with her rabbi, and a former New York City police officer.
Oh my goodness.
He was all these things, was not renewed. The congregation at one point, and this was in the Suffolk Times, this story, it was the paper out of Greenport, changed the locks to lock Rabbi Moskowitz out. Then he moved ahead on creating a second synagogue in Greenport, but that never happened. For the past 6 years, Congregation Tiferet Israel has been under the steady hand of Rabbi Gadi Capella. The Suffolk Times has reported his circuitous route to the position. Born and raised in a Jewish Orthodox family in Israel, he came to the U.S. at age 22 after spending 4 years in the Israeli army. Continued education and initially drew Rabbi Capella to the United States. He studied at Yeshiva University in New York City and went on to become a successful banker at a mid-sized Manhattan firm, but he never lost sight of his faith. He decided to pursue his master's degree at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, began teaching Hebrew scripture, and particularly the book of Genesis, at Our Lady of the Island Catholic Shrine in Manorville, like out here. It was there, as the Suffolk Times story relates, he met Ellen Harbis, a parishioner of St. Agnes R.C. Church in Greenport. As his graduation from the seminary drew closer, Ms. Harbis encouraged Rabbi Capella to seek employment at Greenport's Congregation Tiferet Israel. And there's a quote in the Suffolk Times story, quote, "Even before I started," this is from the rabbi, "I had a recommendation from the Catholic Church." And he goes on, "I didn't want to be in a big synagogue and to be very official. I wanted a one-on-one relationship with people, and that's why I'm getting here." And just incidentally, our rabbi at Adas Israel, Dan Geffen, joined with Rabbi Capella, taking congregants on a trip to Israel 2 years ago. They got along beautifully, and I think that they're both kind of the same Hamish kind of rabbis from Hamish kind of temples. To the west of Congregation Tiferet Israel is the North Fork Reform Synagogue. And it says on its website, "We are a small, inclusive congregation meeting spiritual, educational, social, and cultural and mission needs of our members in the Reform Jewish tradition." They obviously prefer Reform. "We embrace families and individuals, Jews by birth or by choice," which is really great because when you get to the more orthodox levels of Judaism, some of the rabbis don't care for mixed marriages. They feel they lose the tribe and they have all kind of reasons, but still, two people fall in love and they're of different faiths, come on, marry them. And let them pray together, Non-Jews and Jews, regardless of ethnic or racial background, sexual orientation, or gender identity. We support the local community through outreach programs with special emphasis on social justice issues. Now, it's true of Jewish congregation members all over the East End. Many are highly active in their communities. Quote, "We have no permanent staff, so our members build strong bonds as we work together to enrich our lives and keep our congregation vibrant. Our student rabbis from Hebrew Union College, a place where Reform rabbis and cantors are educated, give us fresh perspectives as we learn together. And it meets at a church in Cutchogue. Then in Riverhead, I'm getting to the end, there's Temple Israel of Riverhead. It grows out of and this is pretty old too, but not as old as the Green Port of the State Harbor Synagogues. It grows out of a Brotherhood of Jews of Riverhead, incorporated in 1911. Its first synagogue building opened in 1926. An extensive history of the conservative shul that's online includes these items on it. It's a long history, pages, and some of it to me was so interesting. For example, in the 1930s, Sam Sackstein inadvertently stocks the Peconic River with carp when he digs a trench to link his pond to the river. Prior to the trench, there were a healthy number of fresh pike, pickerel, and perch whitefish in the Peconic, but no carp, a necessary ingredient for gefilte fish. Gefilte fish is this funny kind of mixed fish. Yeah, but a lot of horseradish is fun. So Sam puts in netting at the end of the trench from his pond to prevent his carp from escaping. The roe slips through the net. Thanks to Sam, there's carp swimming in the river today. And I just take a comment, who knew that the Peconic River is a source of gefilte fish? This is not so funny. In 1937, Nazi youths marched on the streets of King Siegfried in nearby Yaphank. Camp Siegfried was the center in the New York metropolitan area for Nazis, for the Bund. They'd come here on and they had streets. It was a Bund settlement. There were streets around the parade grounds, so like Hitler Street and Goebbels Street. The Scheinberg family, and clearly these people were scared then. The Scheinberg family is vigilant. They hide a cache of diamonds in their basement in the event of the Nazis coming into power and the family needing to flee. And this is an earlier generation than ours. Wow. 1982, 1984, member Helene Gerard, the aforementioned Helene Gerard, parades a photographic oral history exhibit, and we're still here. 100 years of small-town Jewish life. The East End Arts and Humanities Council sponsors the exhibit, which travels to area libraries, synagogues, and cultural venues. And I wrote a long story about that, but the Jewish papers, multiple local papers. In 2013, the Jerusalem Post published a story headlined "The Jewish Hamptons." It began by telling how the Hamptons have attracted, in quotes, many Jews who have established thriving institutions. That's correct, but there's been plenty of anti-Semitism through the years. As for the intra-Jewish divisions, based on where one's family landed in the diaspora, the dispersal of Jews over 2 millennia, I mean, this is Meshuggah. I mean, this is crazy. That my relatives could come from Hungary because that's where they landed. On the other hand, on my father's side, on the other hand, my mother's family, they landed and ended up in Poland. And I say it's also been in my family. Grandfather Herman and Grandma Stephanie spoke Hungarian and German, High German, not Yiddish. And Herman, the story goes, wasn't happy when his oldest son, my Uncle Joseph, married a Galiciana. That's from the Galicia region of Poland. Now, my father, too, my mom, her family came from the Galicia region of Poland. Oh, what Surus, Yiddish word for aggravation. This could cause for some Hungarian Jews. The East End has become a vibrant center for Jews. There's now plenty of Jews all over, and Jews have thrived. Here in the town of Southampton, the top elected official, the town supervisor, is Jay Schneiderman, with his family, a member of Temple Oz Israel. His son Reuben was bar mitzvah there, and before that his daughter Magda was bat mitzvah there. In fact, I saw Magda Friday night at services. She was heading off to, it wasn't Friday night, it was Saturday night. some event that Magda was there with Jenny and Jen. She was going off to Israel the next day. And she's named Magda after Jay's mother, who came to the U.S. from Hungary in 1938, and thereafter, and this pervades all of certainly modern Jewish history. It's not new either. Jay relates Hitler wiped out the rest of our family. It's the town, so it's all his mother's side. A few blocks from the old Fahey's watch case factory, our son Adam went to elementary school, then to Pearson High School. Adam went on to law school, became Riverhead Town Attorney, and 3 years back ran for Southampton Town Justice, not winning, but getting a strong vote. And he's chairman of the Southampton Town Zoning Board of Appeals. He lives in Hampton Bays with his law practice in Riverhead. So he succeeded here. The East End has been relatively, and that's the key word, good for Jews. Thank you so much. Does anybody wants to throw a question, please do it. Sir?
In the video, it mentioned that a number of Jews settled in Hampton Bays because they weren't welcome in Southampton, but there's no, I don't think there's ever been a synagogue.
No synagogue in Hampton Bays. Some Jews in Hampton Bays go to a synagogue in St. Mauritius, and some travel, some go to Riverhead. Riverhead is like just up the road. But no synagogue. I don't know why. No synagogue was ever established in Hampton Bays.
Because there weren't any Jews in Hampton Bays, contrary to what Mr. Katz said.
Yeah.
Very much KKK.
Yes.
Probably the largest in New York State, certainly, in Hampton Bays, which is kind of raising its head again against blacks and immigrants rather than Jews. It's strong. So I remember going to Hampton, I live there now, but going there as a child at about the age of 8, and there were signs out, no Jews allowed.
Really?
Yeah, so I don't know where she imagined it. They didn't know.
Well, about what year was that with the no Jews?
Roughly. 51.
Really? After the war.
And I heard that there were flyers last year at all.
Yeah. Hampton Bays has always been a hot spot for conservative thinking, and but Adam's been able to live there, and my son.
Well, today it's fine,
Yeah.
but a lot of it is
Yeah. Oh, also Hampton Bays, it was not much of it. It was Good Ground was the original name, and then renamed it Hampton Bays, figured with Hampton in the name. Economic structure. But Hampton Bays really only, when the hurricane of 38 occurred, and it broke through what's now the Shinnecock Inlet. Until then, the Shinnecock Bay was it's a shallow bay, very polluted. This is even before today's use of nitrogen. And so Hampton Bay was always kind of not successful as a community until the Shinnecock Inlet. And then we got motels, and I think Bert maybe was talking about Jews. I don't know.
I've been trying to remember his name.
Yeah,
When he put up the cell phone and got in touch with me, because I was just going to run the summer fest in December, and invited me to several meetings because he wanted the Sag Harbor Inn to be a Catskill-like resort where Orthodox Jews would come on Friday afternoons, and I was supposed to run programs for them. It was going to be a singles place, just as he described in the report. He had that whole thing, he had notes and notes of what he wanted to do there. And I seem to recall that there were 2 or 3 years when the whole black-hatted people were walking around in Sag Harbor Village and staying at the Sag Harbor Inn. That was his dream, to make it a Catskill singles meeting place.
I was friends with the Gosi. Janet and I were friends with the Gosis. And see, a lot of what happens to people is a product of their time. He was from Poland. I think he told me He escaped from being killed by jumping out of a train on a train to one of the camps. He went to Israel. When Israel, he fought in the War of Independence in Israel. Said his life experience was such. He was also, and bless his soul, he was a wonderful man. And his family, wonderful to this day. You know, he was one of the people in the synagogue who was for the split. He was more traditional in terms of prayer and in politics, in terms of Jewish politics. On the other hand, in terms of, you know, not being like this rabbi, be a rabbi from Greenport, when we first moved here in '74, there was a whole push to tear down Pearson High School. To tear it down and send the kids from Sag Harbor to East Hampton or Southampton. And Agosi felt strongly that this was the wrong thing to do, that it would hurt the community not to have its own high school, and he thought the building was beautiful. He thought it was beautiful. And I remember sitting with him. It was like kind of a version of what we had in East Hampton. And I wrote down what he felt should happen, how it could be renovated without extreme cost. And I ghost wrote, I never mentioned this before, but I ghost wrote, because he's European, English was a second language, a series of articles which ran before the Sag Harbor Express became a very good paper. Vicky Gardner was a lovely lady, but she was the editor. It was a kind of a haphazardly put together book. But Victoria Gardner, ran Agosi's pieces, and I think that was key to saving Pearson High School. And if those articles were the key, Agosi was the key. And in terms of, I mean, if you drive around Sag Harbor, one of the landmarks today is that community's high school. It's a beautiful high school, and it's been renovated. Janet used to work there for 20-some odd years, and it's a good place to work, and it's good for the kids to go. I mean, if they had not had been sent to East Hampton, Southampton, it wouldn't have been the same. Sag Harbor is a very distinct community, and it kind of wouldn't have worked. And the Sag Harbor Inn, anybody who doesn't know that, was built by Charlie Agosi.
Keep that in mind, that singles were meeting all over the place.
Yeah.
In the early 90s, and there should be a place for Orthodox singles.
Yeah, well, Charlie, in the
Health services.
no, he held services that in this fight at LS Israel, and we were members then and all, and I know that my previous doctor, Dan Lessner, was a member, and he also tended to be more orthodox, not conservative, maybe Dan. Dan and Charlie Agosi, a few other people were very much involved in the split, which in part created the Jewish synagogue for hymns. But Charlie was always very comfortable with more of the Hasidic movement. And that's why he had the... Oh, yeah, he did. He did. Yes, there was one more question, I think.
Just a quick note about Rabbi Dan Geffen. He comes from one of the finest rabbinical families in the conservative movement.
Oh, yeah, well, Dan Geffen is an absolute treasure. For anybody who doesn't know him, when we lost Leon Morris, who is now the president of the Pardes Institute in Israel, which is a big job. It's like an international educational enterprise. Big, huge, important position. And he went to Israel really, he didn't know what he was going to end up doing. All he knew, he didn't know. And to fill Leon Morris's shoes, we all worried. And Geffen, he comes from a family going back to Lithuania of rabbis. And he's different than Leon. Leon was this like world-class Jewish intellectual kind of person. Dan is very intellectual as well. I mean, he gives marvelous sermons and so forth. But he's a different kind of, completely warm. I think he's, in fact, yesterday I had a conversation with him because there was a piece in the Southampton Press and East Hampton Press running about my presentation today. So when I got it, yesterday, the East Hampton Press came out yesterday, so I got a couple of copies of the press next door. And I brought it over to the synagogue. I don't know if it was here, but so there's Dan sitting there eating a hamburger in the rabbi's study with this young Hebrew school that's going on, with this like young, sweet-looking Jewish kid with the Dodgers sweatshirt. So I started explaining to the kid about how in my time it was the Brooklyn Dodgers and Pee Wee Reese and Duke Snyder. And so I really can't support the Dodgers. I mean, it was a ridiculous conversation with this kid. But then I went on, which might be more useful. I just told the kid that you are so lucky to have Dan Geffen as your rabbi here. That my rabbis, when I was a kid, what I told the kid were cold fish, and they were. My father was the scoutmaster, and the troop was sponsored by the temple of St. Albans in Queens. And remember, the rabbi was cold. I argued with my father that they shouldn't do overnight hikes where we leave on Friday night and be overnight. And my father said, well, we can't do that when you can have it overnight. Sunday and come back, Monday morning, the kids have. And the rabbi, I remember him saying so stubbornly, where there's a will, there's a way. And in any case, I told the kid that we're so lucky to have Dan Geffen, and we are as a congregation, as your rabbi, at which point Dan responded by telling the kid, well, I pay him to say that. Thank you so much.
Well, we did not pay Carl to say what he just said, but we are lucky to have you, Carl.
Yeah.